Her boss yelled, the room froze, and I whispered the words she needed to hear most. You're amazing. Don't let him see. The office air was heavy with tension, the kind that makes the back of your neck prickle and your chest tighten without warning. Her boss's voice cut sharply through the hum of computers and the quiet clatter of keyboards, a relentless, accusatory rhythm that seemed to shake the very air around her. Papers rattled in her hands, trembling like fragile wings, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just that, her, standing there, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched, eyes flicking briefly to the ceiling as if it could offer some invisible shield. I watched, careful to stay a step removed, yet unable to look away. There was a grace in her composure, even under fire, that drew my attention. Not the polished kind that demanded admiration, but the quiet, human kind. The way her lips pressed together when she swallowed back a sigh, the subtle tremor in her hand as she adjusted a stack of documents. Most people only saw a professional being criticized. I saw the intricate, fleeting details that spoke louder than words ever could. Her presence had always been magnetic, but here, under pressure, it was almost tangible, a kind of warmth that seemed to pulse outward, even across the space between us. I shifted slightly, instinctively closer, though careful not to breach any professional boundaries. The air carried faint traces of her perfume, floral and understated, weaving around the office chaos like a secret comfort. My heartbeat seemed louder than the boss's shouting, and for a second, I realized I wasn't just observing. I was standing guard, silently willing her to feel less alone in the storm. When she flinched at a particularly sharp remark, my hand hovered near hers, not touching, just close enough that I could feel the pull of the moment. My voice came out barely above a whisper, almost drowned by the noise of the office, yet I hoped she'd catch it. You're amazing. Don't let him see. Her eyes flicked toward me, and in that brief glance, something passed. Recognition, gratitude, maybe even relief. The chaos around us seemed to soften for a heartbeat, her tension easing slightly as if my words had formed an invisible shield. It wasn't romance yet, not in the obvious sense, but there was an unspoken connection, fragile and delicate, that threaded between us. I noticed the smallest things, the way her hand relaxed ever so slightly on the papers, the faint exhale that escaped her, almost inaudible but deeply human. In that moment, I realized that admiration wasn't enough. I wanted to protect this quiet strength, to witness it in full bloom without interference from the world. And so I stayed there, a silent anchor in the middle of her storm, my presence steady and calm, hoping she felt it. Even as the boss continued, even as the tension built again, I knew the moment had passed between us. Brief, electric, unforgettable. That small whisper had shifted something in the air, a promise that someone saw her for who she truly was. Amazing, capable, human. The office felt different the next day, not in the way the fluorescent lights or the hum of the air conditioning had changed, but in the quiet awareness between us. She moved with the same grace as before, papers clutched in her hands, but now there was a small softness to her expression whenever our paths crossed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I noticed. The way her eyes lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, the faint curve of a smile that didn't reach her mouth entirely, but enough to signal acknowledgement. I found myself looking for reasons to be near her without being intrusive. A stack of files on the floor, a coffee cup needing a refill, a pen she had left behind. Small excuses that let me bridge the physical gap between us. Each interaction was a thread, weaving a quiet connection that went unnoticed by everyone else, yet felt significant in its own understated way. When I handed her the cup of coffee, our fingers brushed ever so lightly, and I felt a warmth that seemed to radiate outward, a ripple that lingered long after the touch ended. She caught my glance, just for a moment, and the faintest flicker of amusement passed across her features. A shared laugh over a misfiled document or a misplaced spreadsheet became our small private rebellion against the office chaos, moments where the world seemed to shrink around just the two of us. The sound of her laughter, soft and genuine, filled the spaces between the clacking keyboards and ringing phones, leaving a trace of something comforting that I didn't quite have words for yet. There were also silences, comfortable and charged in equal measure. When we found ourselves working side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing, I became acutely aware of the subtle warmth of her presence, the scent of her perfume lingering like a soft echo around her. Every small gesture, the tilt of her head when concentrating, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, felt layered with unspoken meaning, an intricate language neither of us needed to voice. Yet there was restraint, a careful dance we performed without realizing it. Each touch, each glance was measured, respectful of the boundaries neither of us wanted to cross too soon. And in that restraint, the connection deepened. The anticipation became part of the rhythm, a quiet pulse that made ordinary moments feel intimate. When she paused mid-task, I handed her a file, our hands brushing, and this time her eyes held something more than gratitude. A spark of understanding, a recognition that the unspoken support, the small gestures, mattered more than words could capture. It was in that fleeting, shared awareness that I realized this wasn't just admiration anymore. There was a subtle, mutual curiosity building, one grounded in respect, comfort, and the beginnings of something fragile yet undeniable. By the end of the day, as we walked past each other on our way out, there was a moment of hesitation, a quiet, lingering pause, a silent acknowledgement that something new had started, delicate and unspoken, yet firmly planted in the spaces between our shared glances and brushed hands. The foundation had been laid, and the slow burn of connection was quietly, insistently growing. The office felt smaller these days, or maybe it was just the awareness between us that made every shared space feel charged. Sitting across from her at the long conference table, I caught myself noticing things I hadn't before, the way her fingers drummed lightly against her notebook when she was deep in thought, the soft exhale that escaped her lips whenever a problem seemed insurmountable. Most of my colleagues would see only a professional woman focused on her work, but I felt the quiet weight of her emotions, the subtle vulnerability she rarely showed. We were careful around each other, both aware of the invisible lines we hadn't yet crossed. And yet, those lines made every small brush of our hands, every accidental meeting of our gazes, feel electric. In the hallway, her shoulder brushed against mine as we reached for the same stack of documents. It was barely a touch, fleeting, almost dismissible, but my chest tightened in a way that left no doubt. The connection between us had deepened, unspoken but undeniable. I noticed her more acutely in these moments, the way her hair fell slightly across her face, the tilt of her chin when she was thinking, the way her eyes softened whenever she realized I was nearby. And I caught myself holding back, carefully modulating my own movements, forcing a casual air over the thrill that surged each time we were near. There was a quiet tension that lingered like a low hum, a constant undercurrent in every shared glance and every brush of hands that could have been accidental but felt intentional. Even in meetings, my awareness of her never wavered. When her boss interrupted her sharply, demanding answers, I felt that familiar tightening of my chest. My fingers itched to reach out, to offer some invisible shield, and yet I stayed rooted, letting only my eyes convey what words could not. She met that gaze, a flash of acknowledgement passing between us, fleeting yet loaded with meaning. My pulse quickened, and I realized that admiration had shifted into something more profound, a quiet yearning, a desire tempered by restraint. The office sounds, the ringing phones, the soft clatter of keyboards, became a backdrop to our silent communication. Even small gestures carried weight. The brush of her hand as she passed a pen, the almost imperceptible lean toward me when discussing a project. These fleeting moments built tension in a way nothing spoken could, each encounter leaving both of us aware of a growing closeness we weren't yet ready to name. And yet the hesitation lingered. She was confident, self-possessed, and guarded in ways that made the connection all the more tantalizing. I too held myself back, careful not to overstep, careful to let the attraction simmer quietly, to let the moment arrive naturally rather than forcing it. The restraint itself became part of the intimacy, the shared understanding that this connection was fragile, delicate, and entirely our own. By the end of the day, as we both lingered near the elevator, hands hovering near the railing, neither of us spoke. Our eyes met, loaded with a silent acknowledgement of what had begun. A slow, deliberate tension, intimate yet restrained, simmering quietly between us, waiting for the right moment to unfold. The office had emptied slightly by late afternoon, leaving a quiet hum from the computers and the soft rustle of papers as we worked side by side. She paused, fingers hovering over her keyboard, and I noticed the faint crease in her brow that hadn't been there before. It was a small, human detail, easy to miss, but it drew my attention immediately. The air between us seemed to shift, softer somehow, more intimate, as if the silence itself invited honesty. She exhaled, a small, almost imperceptible sigh, and for a moment I considered leaving her be. But something in the way she seemed to search the room for comfort made me stay. "It's been a long week," she admitted quietly, her voice low but not quite steady. There was a tremor there, subtle but real, the kind only someone paying careful attention could detect. I leaned slightly closer, careful not to crowd her, letting the proximity speak of support without intrusion. Her eyes met mine briefly, and she seemed to weigh whether to continue. Finally, she did, a story spilling out in halting words, about a project that went wrong, a colleague who hadn't supported her, the pressure that had mounted silently for weeks. She spoke not for my sympathy, but for relief, and I listened, letting the words fill the space between us without interruption. Every now and then, I offered a small gesture, a nod, a soft murmur of understanding, the faintest touch on the back of her hand when she seemed particularly tense. She didn't pull away. Instead, the tension in her shoulders softened, just a fraction. It was in these small exchanges that the connection deepened. Quiet, unspoken, and profoundly human. I noticed details I had overlooked before. The warmth of her wrist when it brushed mine, the subtle scent of her perfume mixing with the faint aroma of coffee, the way her gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer when she spoke to me than it did with anyone else. Each small, sensory detail seemed to create a world apart from the office chaos, a private space where vulnerability could exist without judgment. She paused again, a nervous laugh escaping despite the seriousness of her words, and I offered the gentlest smile. "You don't have to carry it all alone," I whispered, almost unconsciously, my voice low enough to remain private. She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes searching for some hint of reassurance. In that moment, the distance between us vanished, not physically, but in a way that mattered far more. Emotional walls shifted, letting a quiet trust take root. By the time the conversation drew to a close, there was a new understanding between us. We had shared something fragile and real, and in doing so, a subtle intimacy had formed. She didn't need to say anything more. The warmth in her eyes, the softness of her smile, the quiet exhale that finally seemed unburdened, all of it said enough. For the first time, I realized the bond we were forming wasn't just admiration or fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, rooted in shared vulnerability, empathy, and the small human gestures that carried more weight than words ever could. The slow burn of connection had begun to glow, tender but undeniable, shaping the space between us into something uniquely ours. The office had emptied almost completely, the usual bustle replaced by the soft hum of computers and the distant clatter of chairs being pushed back. We lingered behind, finishing up the day's tasks, but the space between us felt charged in a way it hadn't before. She leaned slightly over her desk, reviewing a document, and I found myself drawn to the subtle curve of her shoulder, the delicate angle of her neck as she concentrated. It was a simple, ordinary scene, but under the quiet light of the office, it felt intimate, almost sacred. I reached for a folder she needed, and our fingers brushed lightly. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet the warmth it left lingered. A shiver of anticipation ran through me, not the sort of heat that demanded action, but a subtle pulse that spoke of awareness, curiosity, and something unspoken. She looked up, meeting my eyes with a faint smile that held both amusement and a quiet acknowledgement of the tension between us. Neither of us said anything words would have ruined it, but in that shared glance, the moment stretched longer than it had any right to. We moved to gather our belongings, walking side by side toward the elevator. The space between us felt smaller, intimate, as if gravity had shifted to pull us closer. She adjusted her bag strap, and our arms brushed again, just enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from her. My heartbeat quickened, yet I reminded myself to remain composed, letting the moment exist without forcing it. The restraint, oddly enough, made the connection more potent. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering softly against the large glass windows. She reached for her umbrella, and our hands met over the handle. Our fingers intertwined briefly, naturally, and lingered. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the slight pulse in her wrist, the quiet strength in her grip. The world around us, the rain, the muted city lights, the soft rush of traffic, faded into the background. For a few moments, it was just her and me, suspended in a quiet, charged intimacy that neither of us had yet named. I caught the way her gaze softened, vulnerability mixed with quiet amusement, and it tugged at something inside me. I wanted to say something, anything, to capture the moment, but I stayed silent, letting it breathe. The tension was a slow burn, building with each shared smile, each accidental touch, each wordless acknowledgement of our growing connection. Even as the elevator doors closed and the office faded behind us, the closeness lingered. We weren't together yet. Not in any overt way, but the subtle, magnetic pull between us had grown impossible to ignore. Every brush of hands, every shared glance, every heartbeat in proximity was a promise that this connection was evolving, inching closer to something undeniable. By the time we parted ways for the evening, the anticipation had deepened, a quiet ache of desire and admiration intertwined. Neither of us crossed the boundary we both felt, yet neither of us wanted to. The slow burn of intimacy, emotional and physical in its quietest, most delicate form, was reaching a new peak, poised for the moment when it would finally transform into something more explicit, something mutual and utterly human. The office was quiet in a way it rarely was, the usual hum of computers and phones replaced by a tense stillness. A sudden confrontation with her boss had left her visibly shaken again, papers scattered across the desk, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to gather them. I stepped closer, my instinct to offer comfort stronger than ever, and for the first time, I realized just how much I wanted to be there for her. Not just in passing, but fully, emotionally, completely. She looked up, eyes wide, and I could see the exhaustion etched into her features. Without thinking, I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, my fingers lingering at the edge of her cheek. The contact was brief, careful, but the warmth between us was undeniable. She didn't pull away. Instead, her gaze softened, vulnerability meeting unspoken understanding. For a moment, the office, the chaos, the reprimands, all of it, faded into the background. I leaned slightly closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You don't have to face this alone," I murmured. My words were simple, but they carried the weight of sincerity, the kind that doesn't demand anything in return. She swallowed, a faint tremor in her lips betraying the emotions she usually kept locked away. And then, softly, she admitted, almost to herself, I didn't think anyone noticed. Not really. That confession, fragile and real, changed everything. The distance that had existed between us, the careful professional boundary, the hesitant restraint, melted in that instant. I could feel her hand hover near mine, and I let my own rest lightly against hers, the contact deliberate but gentle. Her warmth radiated through my fingertips, and I could feel her pulse, subtle but insistent, mirroring the quickening rhythm of my own heartbeat. We stayed like that for a long moment, eyes locked, breaths mingling in the quiet of the office. No words were necessary. The emotional intimacy spoke louder than anything we could say. I realized then that this connection wasn't just admiration, not just fascination. It was mutual, deep, and undeniable. The subtle glances, the lingering touches, the quiet support. All of it had been building toward this, a moment of recognition that we both felt but hadn't admitted. Her shoulders relaxed slightly as she let herself lean just a fraction closer, her trust in me evident in the smallest of gestures. I wanted to tell her everything, the admiration, the quiet longing, the care that had grown stronger with every passing day, but I held back, letting the moment breathe. Sometimes, presence says more than words ever could. By the time the tension eased, the emotional landscape between us had shifted irrevocably. The bond was no longer tentative. It was solidified by vulnerability, honesty, and the quiet acknowledgement of mutual attraction. The slow burn that had been simmering for weeks had reached a turning point, illuminating a path forward, one that was tender, respectful, and entirely our own. And in that still, charged silence, I knew that nothing could ever make us feel alone again. Not while this connection existed, alive in every glance, every touch, every unspoken word. The office felt lighter that morning, as if the air itself had shifted after the emotional revelations of the day before. Papers still cluttered desks and the hum of computers persisted, but it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it carried a quiet warmth, a background that seemed to soften the edges of the world. She moved with the same composed grace as always, but now there was a subtle ease in her movements, a softness to the way she interacted with everyone around her. We found ourselves together at our usual spot by the coffee machine, the ritual no longer just convenience but something that had become quietly intimate. I handed her the cup before she could reach for it, and our fingers brushed, lingering longer than necessary. She looked up, eyes meeting mine with a faint, knowing smile, a smile that spoke of trust, understanding, and the subtle acknowledgement of the bond we had nurtured. In that small gesture, I felt the culmination of weeks of shared glances, subtle touches, and unspoken care. We walked side by side toward the elevators, the space between us comfortable, charged yet calm. Her presence was magnetic in a way that didn't demand attention but invited it, and I couldn't help but notice the warmth radiating from her, the faint scent of her perfume blending with the crisp morning air. Our conversation was light, playful, yet every word carried an undercurrent of the deeper connection we now shared. There was laughter, genuine and unguarded, echoing softly against the walls, and for the first time, it felt like a sound that belonged to both of us, private in its intimacy. During a quiet moment, she reached for a pen I had absent-mindedly picked up for her, and our fingers brushed again. This time, neither of us recoiled. The contact was deliberate, familiar, yet respectful, a gentle acknowledgement of the trust and affection that had grown between us. It was in these small, seemingly ordinary gestures that the depth of our connection was most evident: touches, glances, shared smiles, and laughter carrying the weight of weeks of subtle tension and emotional honesty. By lunchtime, we found ourselves sitting together, not out of necessity but choice, comfortably close. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught her hair in a golden halo, and I realized how naturally her presence had become part of my world. A hand rested lightly on hers, fingers intertwining briefly, a quiet promise of companionship and understanding. The warmth lingered, not urgent or demanding, but steady and reassuring. There was no dramatic declaration, no climactic moment, yet the resolution was undeniable. The slow burn that had begun with whispered encouragement and lingering glances had matured into a shared intimacy, gentle and affirming. We understood each other in ways words could not capture, finding comfort in presence, warmth in small touches, and joy in the unspoken understanding that neither of us were alone anymore. As the day ended, and we stepped out of the office together, our shoulders brushed, and a soft smile passed between us. It was the quiet, perfect closure of a story that had built itself slowly, tenderly, through observation, care, and emotional honesty. The world outside felt softer, more vibrant, and in that shared space, we knew the connection we had forged would endure, a delicate yet unbreakable thread binding us together.